The Daito Ryu tradition is said to have been founded roughly 900 years ago by an individual named Shinra Saburo Minamoto no Yoshimitsu. Yoshimitsu is said to have taken the name Daito from the place where he lived, the Daito no Yakata, in the Omi region. As a youngster, he was also known as Daito Saburo. Shinra Saburo's descendants were linked through the ages to the Takeda clan in the Kai region of Japan, the same clan from which the famous warlord Takeda Shingen would eventually emerge. Daito Ryu was passed down as a family jujutsu tradition, or kaden, within the Takeda family in Kai. When the remnants of that Takeda clan later resettled in the Aizu region, Daito Ryu too went with them. Within the Aizu samurai culture, there also existed a system of etiquette called Oshikiyuchi, meaning within the Great Threshold. This had been passed down through the generations until reaching the last elder counselor of the domain, Saigo Tanomo. Oshikiyuchi and the Daito Ryu tradition of the Takedas were both eventually learned by one Sokaku Takeda, who would later become known as the interim restorer of Daito Ryu. Around the middle of the Meiji period, Sokaku brought Daito Ryu Jujutsu together with Oshikiyuchi, which he had learned from Saigo Tanomo, forming the basis of what we now call Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu. Sokaku is said to have taught approximately 30,000 students during his lifetime. He never established a dojo of his own, preferring to travel around Japan, going off to teach wherever he was invited, often to various types of police and military organizations. He often went out to teach unaccompanied by his own personal students, instead selecting local volunteers on whom to demonstrate his techniques. Many of these he had never met before, and many also happened to be skilled practitioners of other Budo already. The fact that he approached his teaching this way, and the fact that many of those he encountered later became his students, I think demonstrates the clearly high caliber and effectiveness of his Daito Ryu technique. Especially impressive was the fact that while he stood less than 5 feet high, he was still able to work effectively against much larger opponents, even against men the size of sumo wrestlers, all of whom he could throw or submit with little difficulty. Sokaku Sensei also seems to have been gifted with intense insight into human nature, to the extent that he could often intuit or predict things about people. For example, once when he had been invited to teach a police seminar, before beginning the lesson he suddenly turned to a particular individual and ordered him to leave the room. The police chief in charge naturally couldn't imagine why this man had been suddenly expelled. The reason apparently had nothing to do with any offense or breach of etiquette, but simply that Sokaku had identified him as a potential troublemaker. And sure enough, a month or two later the same man, it became known, was found involved in some kind of scandal for which he had been dismissed from the police force. This sort of thing seems to have occurred many times throughout Sokaku's teaching career, and one gets the impression of a man with extraordinary insight into people's characters. Sokaku kept meticulous records of his teaching activities in the form of attendance books called Eimeiroku and payment ledgers called Shareiroku. Many of these have been preserved and still exist today. The Eimeiroku offer dated records of all the people Sokaku taught or trained with during his travels. The Shareiroku contain records of the fees he received for his teaching, including mention of the amounts paid and the duration of the training. We know from these that 10-day training seminars seem to have been one of the most common teaching patterns he used. Sokaku's Eimeiroku and Shareiroku have been largely preserved, and together constitute a fairly clear record of his teaching activities. It is from these that we can verify the number 30,000 as the number of students he taught during his lifetime. It's often been said that Sokaku taught different things to different types of people, or that he adapted his teaching to suit the varying physiques and characters of different types of students. For example, if the student was tall or short, large or small, heavy or thin, muscular or slight of build, or a woman, and so on. That's what some have said, but given what we know of his character, I doubt he did that, or even that he could have done that. It's also often said that he would never teach the same technique twice for fear that if he showed things too clearly, people would figure out his techniques too easily. Now, a teacher known for that sort of mindset is not the sort to bother teaching 10 different things to 10 different people. I think what actually happened was that he simply demonstrated what he had to offer and told his students to take whatever they could get by watching. He allowed his students to steal his techniques, but he would never just give them away. I don't think he explained what he was doing very clearly. The result was that everybody learning from him interpreted what they saw somewhat differently. He didn't teach them differently, he simply demonstrated and let people get what they could from it. And that, I think, is largely the reason his various students ended up adopting so many different technical approaches. Morihei Ueshiba Sensei, the founder of Aikido, is of course very well known and hardly needs an introduction from me. In many ways, it's thanks to the spread of Aikido so far and wide that Daito Ryu has also been brought into the spotlight in recent years. Among Sokaku Takeda's thousands and thousands of students, Ueshiba Sensei certainly had to have been one of the most talented. Ueshiba Sensei began his training under Sokaku in 1915, and his name appears in the Daito Ryu records up until 1931. Other sources suggest his activity as a Daito Ryu practitioner may have continued even as late as 1935. In any case, the point is that he was one of Sokaku's most long-term students, and I think he also received what was, at that time, the highest license offered by the Daito Ryu tradition. Seikyo Asano was a vice admiral in the Japanese Imperial Navy. Isamu Tekeshita was an admiral. Ueshiba Sensei at that time had opened a dojo called the Ueshiba Juku in the town of Ayabe. Asano was training there in Aikido very enthusiastically, and in that connection he took Ueshiba Sensei and also Inoue Sensei to introduce them to Admiral Takeshita and have them demonstrate their techniques for him. Takeshita was by nature a very diligent and meticulous individual. From the time he was a boy, he kept a journal recording his daily activities, with many descriptive entries that even today give us a very clear picture of how things were back then. Entries mentioning his Daito Ryu training begin appearing from December 2, 1925. Many simply list the fact, using phrases like Jujutsu training, or trained in Daito Ryu Jujutsu, or trained every day in Jujutsu, and so on like that. Takeshita also kept what he called Aikijujutsu training notebooks, in which he recorded in great detail all of the techniques he learned and practiced during his Daito Ryu training. These entries fill a total of 22 notebooks describing about 15,000 techniques. In addition to these, Takeshita also wrote down some of his more philosophical observations in a set of 3 other notebooks titled Ken no Maki, Kon no Maki, and Chi no Maki. Around 1942 or 1943, Takeshita was teaching martial arts at Seishin Women's College, which at that time was one of the nation's more prestigious schools for girls and young ladies. He was teaching them what we can assume were self-defense techniques for women, and from that time there remains a sort of textbook in which these teachings are shown in drawings. Besides their martial arts content, these drawings give us a very clear picture of some of the types of clothing worn by both men and women at that time, and so this book is actually a rather interesting historical document.
着ているものなんかがですね、克明に書かれておりますので、そういう面からも大変貴重な資料だと思います。それも現存しております。
Takuma Hisa sensei was one of only 2 students under Sokaku Takeda to have received the Menkyo Kaiden certification. Hisa was an employee at the Asahi newspaper company in Osaka, and thus was active mostly in the Kansai area in western Japan. An entry on the opening page of one of Sokaku's Eimeiroku, dated 1939, reads, Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu Somucho, beside which are written the names of both Sokaku Takeda and his son, Tokimune, in a kind of joint signature. Within this Eimeiroku, it is recorded that Hisa sensei had received Menkyo Kaiden certification from both Sokaku and Tokimune.
武田総覚先生、時宗先生、両方からのお名前で免許開伝をいただいております。Hisa
sensei also compiled an 11-volume photographic technical series he called the Soden. Volumes 1 through 6 contain techniques learned from Ueshiba sensei between 1934 and 1936. Volumes 7 through 10 contain techniques learned from Sokaku Takeda sensei between 1936 and 1939.
武田総覚先生にご指導を受けたものだそうです。それは11年から14年の頃だと思います。
In addition to the photographic sequences compiled in the Soden, Hisa sensei also wrote down elsewhere very clear detailed descriptions of how to perform many of the techniques he had learned. There was a period during which Hisa sensei seems to have been worried about finding a formal successor, and at one time he even asked me to take that position. Of course, it was a great honor to be considered for that, but I had to refuse on the grounds that I was already a pupil of Tokimune Takeda sensei and felt loyalty to him. Hisa sensei told me that he understood my position and let the matter go with no bad feelings. At that time, he told me of the existence of what he called the Soden techniques, which he had learned from Sokaku Takeda. I said I would be very interested in having those, and he agreed to teach me. Along with that instruction, he also gave me copies of the technical photos he had compiled of his Daito Ryu studies, as well as copies of the technical instructions he'd written down. Tokimune Takeda was born in 1916 in the town of Shimoyubetsu in Hokkaido in northern Japan, the third son of Sokaku Takeda. Even as a young boy, he received strict training from his father. He recounted to me, for example, that his father used to send him outside during the winter, toss a saw out behind him, and slam shut the doors to the house. Now, being Hokkaido, it was of course extremely cold outside, well below freezing, and to keep warm the young Tokimune had no choice but to start sawing wooden logs that were piled there. Besides making him tough in general, this kind of exercise also ensured that he developed strong legs and hips, which of course are essential for any martial artist. In effect, Sokaku was intentionally grooming his son through such hard training from that very young age to be his designated successor in Daito Ryu. Tokimune's actual training in Daito Ryu started, I believe, around 1925, and it was about 14 years later, in 1939, that he eventually received the title of Somucho, or General Director, from his father. When Sokaku passed away in 1943, Tokimune then officially adopted a second title, Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu Honbucho, or head of the Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu, and with that formally took over the leadership of the tradition as Sokaku's designated successor. Daito Ryu Aikijujutsuの継承者として活躍されます。それで昭和29年に Unlike his father, who had never settled down to teach Daito Ryu in any one place, in 1954 Tokimune established a permanent dojo, which he set up at first in the converted warehouse of a fisheries company. He later established the Daito-kan dojo to serve as a kind of home base for Daito Ryu. From that point on, he began using the name Daito Ryu Aiki Budo instead of the more traditional Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu. He also adopted the title Soke, or familial headmaster, which until that point had not existed within the Daito Ryu tradition. Traditionally, Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu never had any kind of dan ranking system of the type common today, and instead had a more traditional licensing system of the type used in most classical Budo. The first license awarded would have been Hiden Mokuroku, which included all of the first 118 techniques we learn today. The problem is, given the pace of our training in this modern age, learning all of these techniques sufficiently today takes about 20 years. In other words, today it would take about 20 years of study before a student could be awarded the Hiden Mokuroku scroll, with absolutely no credentials issued before that point. For that reason, within Daito Ryu Aiki Budo, Tokimune Sensei established a Q and Dan ranking system, I think probably to give people something to show for their efforts at a sooner point in their training. As leader of the Daito Ryu tradition, Tokimune Sensei never issued licenses of any kind using the name Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu, except to me and one other person. Every certificate he issued was under the name Aiki Budo instead. Also, throughout his entire history, Daito Ryu never used any kind of dan ranking system as I have just talked about, nor did the title Soke exist. Both of these began with Tokimune Sensei as part of his efforts to offer Daito Ryu to a wider, more modern public. Still, despite these modern additions, it's also the case that in all official public forums, for example demonstrations at the Japan Budokan and elsewhere, Tokimune Sensei always presented the art as the more traditional Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu. Another of Tokimune Sensei's contributions to Daito Ryu was to divide the techniques in the Hiden Mokuroku into 5 groups numbered Ikkajo through Gokajo. He also gave each technique a formal name, since before that time they had been identified in the scrolls simply as number 1, number 2, and so on. This was one of the major changes to the Daito Ryu tradition that occurred through the transition between Sokaku Takeda and his son and successor, Tokimune. Another significant difference was that while Sokaku had taught primarily prominent or elite members of society, Tokimune opened the doors of his dojo to everybody and anybody who had an interest in training, thereby making Daito Ryu accessible to a wider range of people than it ever had been before. Although he never really showed it, Tokimune Sensei was a very hard worker, both in terms of his dedication to the Daito Ryu tradition and in his constant efforts to train and forge himself through that tradition. Physically, these efforts could be seen in the thick calluses on both index fingers, not to mention his amazingly strong hands and arms, both the result of his years of constant hard training. In many ways, Tokimune also continued many of the same teaching methods used by his father. This included teaching many techniques in a way that would not reveal the true essence. His view was that a fair proportion of students would eventually leave the dojo and stop training in Daito Ryu for whatever reasons. This, he felt, would cause the Daito Ryu tradition to flow away and become diluted. For that reason, he often avoided teaching the true essence of things, so that Daito Ryu would remain as intact as possible. I'll give you an example. Tokimune Sensei used to hold special seminars once a year in Abashiri, where people could learn directly from him. At one of these, he divided the class into two, one taught by him, the other taught by me in my capacity as Kyoju Dairi, or his teaching representative. Naturally, I went to him the evening before to ask what material I should cover and how I should teach it. I was surprised by some of his orders, though, about how to teach some of the techniques, because they were not what I had learned from him. The technique Ippondori, for example. At the Daitokan Dojo, he apparently taught students to do Ippondori by catching the arm in front of their head, like a block. But he had instructed me specifically not to do it that way, not to stop the attack like a block, and instead to move in on the attacker before he could complete his movement. Or I should say that I too was taught to stop the attack with a block first, but later on, when I questioned him about this, he suddenly changed the technique and told me to do it a different way, which was to move in and break the opponent's balance quickly at the moment of contact. That's what he had taught me, so I asked him if that's how I should teach the students at the seminar, and to my surprise he said, "No, don't teach that." Basically, he was doing the same thing that Sokaku had been doing by not teaching the same technique twice. That is to say, he was deliberately obscuring the real meaning or essence of his techniques. It was only after you put in your time training, came up with questions, and approached him with the right kinds of questions that he would finally teach you the right thing. Through the quality of his students' questions, he judged their level and progress, and ability or lack of it, and according to that level, he would change the way he taught that person. That was his approach to technique, and that was how I learned, training the way I was told, running into questions and doubts, asking about them, and gradually being taught in different ways. I was born in 1945 near the end of the war in Tokyo. There was a Daito Ryu dojo in my neighborhood where I lived, in an area called Koiwa. It was called the Shin-Eikan, operated by a teacher named Tsunejiro Hosono, who had been a high-level student of Sokaku Takeda. So I joined that dojo and began learning from Hosono Sensei. Hosono Sensei was a very warm individual, very gentle and mild-mannered for what you might expect of a Budo man, the kind of person who was always doing things for other people. Around 1963, Hosono Sensei suddenly took ill and was hospitalized. I went to see him in the hospital, and during that visit he told me he wouldn't be able to teach me anymore because of his condition. He told me to go learn from a teacher named Kotaro Yoshida. Eventually, Hosono Sensei passed away, and I did as he instructed and went to enroll in the dojo of Kotaro Yoshida. When I wrote my name in his enrollment book, I saw the names of numerous well-known people, including Masatatsu Oyama Sensei of karate fame, among others. Oyama Sensei, it seems, had studied Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu under Yoshida for a considerable period of time.
Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu を習われ、また相当で習われたみたいですね。それから当時吉田幸太郎先生は
Yoshida Sensei was paralyzed on his left side, although he had no problem speaking. He taught me by telling me what to do and demonstrating with his right hand. One thing that was unusual was that he would charge a certain fee for each technique he taught. For this fee, he would continue teaching and working with me on that particular technique until I could do it and remember it well. For me, it was a very good way to learn, and I think rather unique also. Eventually, Yoshida Sensei told me he had taught me about as much as he was able to given his physical condition. He said that if I wanted to continue, I should go to train with a teacher named Tokimune Takeda, living in the city of Abashiri in Hokkaido, and he gave me an introduction to do so. So during my summer vacation, in 1966, I struck out for Abashiri in Hokkaido to learn from Tokimune Sensei for the first time. I stayed there for about a month that first visit, and during that time, I truly began to doubt myself, to wonder what all of my training up to that point had been about. I hadn't realized it, but there were so many things wrong with my technique and everything else. I felt this very keenly as he began correcting absolutely everything about my Daito Ryu, starting even with very basic items. The training was very hard. I remember practically crawling back to the inn where I was staying, barely able to walk because I was so tired and because my body hurt so much. It was so bad that I even found a stick near the side of the road and used that as a cane to help me get back and forth from the inn to the dojo. I remember laying in bed every night feeling absolutely terrible about my lack of ability and ashamed at how good for nothing I was. Eventually, though, my efforts did pay off. In 1969, I received authorization to open a branch dojo in Katsushika Ward in Tokyo, which I did the following year. A while later, in 1974, I received from Tokimune Sensei certification as Kyoju Dairi, or teaching representative. I should mention, by the way, that all of these things were within the framework of Tokimune Sensei's Daito Ryu Aiki Budo. Besides establishing the Katsushika branch dojo, I also set up a number of other branches around Tokyo. And for these activities, I received authorization from Tokimune Sensei to serve as the general headquarters for these Tokyo area dojos. In May 1988, I received the certification called Menkyo Kaiden, or License of Complete Transmission in Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu. At the same time, I also received within the Daito Ryu Aiki Budo framework the certification Soke Dairi, or Official Representative of the Soke. Something I'd like to touch on here is that the Menkyo Kaiden I received is not for Daito Ryu Aiki Budo, but rather within the framework of Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu. At the time, I held the title of Daito Ryu Aiki Budo Tokyo So Shibucho, that is the general director of all of the Tokyo branch dojos. But the Menkyo Kaiden I received from Tokimune Sensei indicated that all the techniques he had taught me were to be considered within the Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu framework, that is, not the Aiki Budo framework. And to validate this, he signed and chopped the certificate using the title Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu Somucho Takeda Tokimune, as opposed to the title Soke, which had been his modern Aiki Budo equivalent. About a year later, 1989, Tokimune Sensei's wife passed away. They had been a very close couple, and I think he was very much affected by her death. Partly as a result of the shock of her passing, Tokimune Sensei's own health began to deteriorate as well, and he himself began needing medical treatment. Now, in that situation, Tokimune's pupils all should have come together to support the Daito Ryu tradition to ensure its continuance. As it happened, though, a number of them decided to split from the group and even submitted signed forms indicating their resignation from the Daito Kan Dojo and their intention to depart from under the tutelage of the Soke. In effect, these were a statement of resignation and withdrawal from participation in the Daito Ryu tradition as taught by Tokimune Sensei. In 1994, feeling that the Daito Ryu tradition was in danger of falling into disarray, the remaining heads of all the branch dojos around Japan held a meeting with the intention of restoring some sort of unity to the group. At that meeting, I was asked to take on the positions of Honbucho and Somucho, and so I formally adopted these titles, and in effect the leadership of the Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu tradition. That took place in September of that year, 1994. In any case, that's the background of the current situation. There is also the issue of official registration of the rights to use the Daito Ryu name. Originally, the application for this registration was made in Tokimune Sensei's name. But while that application was still pending, his health took a turn for the worse, and eventually he was declared by court order to be unfit to continue the process. So, after a great deal of discussion and deliberation, it was decided to continue the application under my name instead, and so that's what happened. Now I would like to give some explanation about the procedures for etiquette used in Daito Ryu. You may have noticed some slight differences in the ways I and Amano Shihan across from me just bowed to one another. To explain these, in nearly all cases except when bowing to your own teacher, you first extend your left hand, followed then by the right. This is because as you bow, you are making a mental check of the safety of the situation, protecting your right hand, which you would need to draw your sword, from being cut. So you put your left hand out first, and then, after having judged your opposite to be a non-aggressor, you place your right hand down. Then you execute the bow simply by bending your elbows and then straightening them again. Then you follow the opposite procedure, withdrawing first the important right hand, then the left hand. This is the normal way to bow in almost all cases. There are two exceptions, however, which include bowing to your teacher and bowing to the Shinzen, that is the Shinto altar in the front of the dojo. In both cases, you put both hands out at once to indicate the relationship of implicit trust that you already have. In bowing like this, you indicate your respect and trust of the other person. This is the reason for the differences in the way Amano Shihan and I have just bowed to one another. You will also notice that both of us have placed our swords at our right sides, as opposed to at our left sides. This is because in traditional thinking, placing your sword to your right side would allow you to draw it at any time. Therefore, to indicate that you have no aggressive intentions, you put your sword to your right, where it was less easy to draw. The first group of techniques studied in Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu are named the Hiden Mokuroku. The Hiden Mokuroku curriculum contains a total of 118 techniques, which are divided into 5 sets numbered Ikkajo through Gokajo, or Set 1 through Set 5. Ikkajo, Nikajo, and Sankajo have 30 techniques each, while Yonkajo has 15 and Gokajo has 13, making a total of 118. Each of the 5 sets has a distinct technical emphasis. Ikkajo, for example, emphasizes breaking your opponent's balance at the moment of contact. Nikajo emphasizes attacking your opponent's joints. Sankajo blocks attacks using an X-block configuration leading into wrapping-type joint locks. Yonkajo emphasizes attacking the inside of the opponent's wrist, and Gokajo emphasizes attacking the opponent's fingers. So, now let's take a look at some of these techniques. First, I'll demonstrate the characteristics of Ikkajo, starting with the technique Ippondori. As you can see here, I break his balance the instant we come into contact. Once more. Next, Gyaku Udedori. In this technique, the opponent comes to grab the front of my clothing, and as his grip begins to close, I shift and break his balance by striking him under the chin and elbow. Next, Kuruma Daoshi. I break his balance completely as soon as we come into contact. Not like this. You should never do this. Because I break his balance at the moment of contact, I have to enter. Or if I'm not in time, I can also move around like this. In all cases, I break his balance right at the moment of contact, and not later. Slowly now. At this point, the opponent's energy and momentum is in a yang or positive state. This is because his attack is already in full motion. So I shift a bit, and to that energy I add my own yang or positive energy, and in that way break his balance. So, in this way, the most important element of Ikkajo is this instant unbalancing action. Now let's look at the techniques emphasized in Nikajo. Here the opponent attacks, and I respond by taking him into a wrist lock called kotezume. Next, shitozume. Here again I used another kind of wrist lock. Moving on to Sankajo, or the third set, I respond to his attack with a cross block. Stopping the attack like this differs from the rule in Ikkajo, where we learn to break the opponent's balance instantly. In Sankajo, we stop his attack, or rather we stop it just for a moment, but then as quickly as possible take his arm into a balance-breaking, wrapping-type control called makizume. One important point here is to make a right angle of his arm, and apply pressure enough to make his heels rise off the ground. This method of starting from a cross block and moving into a wrapping-type control is the emphasis of the Sankajo set. Next is Yonkajo. While in Sankajo we block like this, in Yonkajo this block is reversed with the hands in the opposite way. In Sankajo the right hand is on top and the left on bottom, but in Yonkajo the right hand is below, palm up, and the left hand is on top, palm down. At this point you control the opponent at the inside of his wrist and forearm, and use this control to throw. Here we use the inside of the wrist to throw. This is the technical emphasis of Yonkajo. Finally, in Gokajo, we emphasize attacks to the opponent's fingers. This is one possibility. Here is another. This is a Yonkajo technique, but it foreshadows other techniques in Gokajo that use the back of the wrist to attack the opponent's fingers, like this. In this way, the distinguishing characteristics of sets 1 through 5, or Ikkajo through Gokajo, are clearly identified. The first 3 sets of the Hiden Mokuroku, that is, Ikkajo through Sankajo, are further divided into 4 types of techniques. These include seated, standing, half-seated, half-standing, and rear techniques. In Japanese, these are called Idori, Tachiai, Hanza handachi, and Ushiordori. Idori techniques are done while seated against an attacker who is also seated. Hanza handachi techniques are done while seated against an attacker who is standing. Tachiai techniques are done standing against an attacker who is also standing. And finally, Ushiordori techniques are those done against an attacker who attacks from behind. Idori techniques are distinguished by the fact that you are sitting on the floor and therefore are limited in the amount you can move and shift your hips. In particular, you have no way to lower your center further than it already is, since the floor is in the way. Idori techniques are therefore designed to give you practice compensating for these limitations. They also require precise study of how to apply Aiki in such a situation. So now let me demonstrate a few techniques that illustrate the body movement and application of Aiki used in Idori techniques. When the opponent strikes down at my head, in terms of body movement, my best option is to move my hips forward and break his balance at the instant of contact, like this. Another technique is shitozume. He comes to take my wrist. At that point, I apply Aiki like this, just as his grip begins to close. Particularly important is how I use my little finger, or the edge of my hand. Just as he grabs, I drop my center internally and turn my hand slightly to apply the technique. For the purposes of illustration, I'll do a technique which actually is not in the Daito Ryu basic curriculum. This is Hanza handachi ippondori. In other words, sitting, doing ippondori against a standing attack. Back in the Edo period, I'm sure there must have been some situations in which a standing attacker would attack a sitting opponent. Probably this sort of thing doesn't exist now, but the same physical relationship would be true when dealing with a much taller opponent. And for that reason, I think practicing Hanza handachi techniques has uses even in modern times. As you can see, if I try to do a normal ippondori, inevitably the difference in height makes it impossible for me to break his balance at the moment of contact. I can't enter in time or deep enough. But what I can do is take advantage of his attacking energy, shifting to let it pass, and then coming around behind, adding my own energy to his, to take control. In shitozume too, allowing the opponent to complete his attack in a stable, solid position, for example by extending your hands like this so that he can grab without bending down, this gives him the advantage. Many people do this in similar techniques and extend their hands to the opponent, but I teach not to, since it puts you at a disadvantage. Instead, allow your opponent to break his own balance slightly, as he will generally do. This gives you an opportunity to then amplify the unbalance and apply your technique. While Idori techniques are done more or less on a flat plane, Hanza handachi gives your opponent the advantage of being able to move in the vertical dimension. You have to make up for this with timing and technique by looking for and attacking weaknesses in his otherwise advantageous position. Now let's take a look at some Tachiai applications. As I said, Idori involves movement mostly on a single plane, forward and back, and from side to side. Since you're sitting, you can move your center upwards but not downwards, and in this sense, Idori techniques are quite limited in their range of possible movement. Tachiai, on the other hand, allows you complete freedom of movement in your hips and center, and so many of the standing techniques take advantage of this fact. At the moment we come into contact, I break his balance. It's not necessarily a specific hand position or movement that must be done here. The point rather is to figure out how best to break your opponent's balance and also how to affect the position of his joints using the movement of your hips and the shifting of your body. In this technique too, you can see that the key points are how to use your hips and the movement of your hands in order to apply Aiki. Ushiordori, as the name suggests, deals with attacks coming from the rear. One of the main reasons to practice this kind of attack from the rear is to train your power of discernment, perception, and prediction, that is, the ability to sense what is going to happen before it actually does happen. Ushiordori is not just techniques against attacks that happen to come from behind, rather it is the practice of these deeper kinds of skills of perception and intuition. By doing this kind of practice, you learn how to sense and intuit your opponent in his position using all 5 senses. You have to consider this kind of sensing as an integral part of Ushiordori technique. This is the inherent meaning in Ushiordori training, and without attention to this kind of thing, there will be little point in practicing it. Ippondori is one of the most representative techniques among the 30 techniques in the Ikkajo set. It is a technique that ultimately practices dealing with an attack using a live sword, striking down from an overhead position. In our practice, our opponent uses the blade of his hand to indicate the cut with the sword. Therefore, because you have to think of this hand as representing a blade, blocking like this would not be effective. Even in the empty-handed technique, you would be overwhelmed by his power, so you have to break his attack before this point, like this. Then, to the area that would be open in a traditional suit of armor, I execute a thrust with what in reality would be a dagger. Today we simply indicate this dagger using a fist with the middle finger knuckle raised. At the same time, I also control his arm by keeping a firm grip on the vital point just below his elbow, like this. Then, without raising my hips, I bring him down under my center. It's important that I bring him all the way down under my center, completely. If I don't, he'll be able to stand up and counterattack. So it's essential to break his posture completely. Then, targeting the vital point under his arm, I turn and kick through his side, as if I want to kick all the way through. Then I continue pinning him by applying pressure to the outside of his wrist as part of the pin. Then I execute a finishing strike, making sure that my hand is fully open and above my head. This hand position represents the use of a short sword. Next, the Ura version of Ippondori. I make use of my opponent's ki, that is, his attacking energy. Essentially, I take his yang or positive energy and absorb it into my own yang movement to control it. I let his aggressive energy go past without trying to block it, and use that energy to turn him down and around. I let him pass and turn him down and around like this. As always, the important point is to unbalance him at the instant of contact, no matter what technique I'm using. Once again, he strikes to my head, and I bring him down and around. Now let's look at this same technique, Ippondori, done against a sword cut. This technique is done against an opponent trying to grab your two wrists. As with all of the other techniques, it is essential that I unbalance him at the instant we come into contact. Another important point is that I not put my hands out for him to grab. Instead of putting my hands out, I make sure always to keep them at my side near my own body. This allows me to apply Aiki at just the right moment. That is, just when he comes to grip my wrists. I break his balance, then keep him in that state while I make what would be a cut across his midsection and throw. I should also mention that in doing this technique I am loosening my grip a little bit so that he can take a fall safely. As I showed, just as he grabs me, I apply Aiki to unbalance him. I keep him unbalanced all the way through. At this point, pressure is being applied to these three joints all at the same time, and if I continue to do this, I think they would break or dislocate. For that reason, I loosen up a bit before throwing so that he can fall safely. If I were to throw with all three of his joints locked like this, some or all of them would be completely dislocated. So I loosen them up a bit. As you can see, I loosened the pressure on all of his joints as I threw him. Now, as I did with Ippondori, I'll demonstrate Daito Ryu's Shihonage using a sword. Daito Ryu actually contains a number of different Shihonage techniques, or patterns, and I'll show just one of them here. We start in a Seigan or mid-level stance. When the opponent lifts his sword to strike, I enter. I enter pressing in and in with an application of Aiki, and then I release that Aiki and turn to cut through the middle. Then I raise up and cut down with a diagonal cut, like this. I apply Aiki, then move across the opponent's midsection, turn and raise up as if with raising a sword, across, up, and cut down diagonally. Across the middle, up, turn, and cut diagonally. When he raises up, at that instant I enter, which is the same as applying Aiki here. Then with Aiki applied, I move through, breaking his balance, turn, raise, and then I loosen the grip for safety as I mentioned, and cut down diagonally, throwing. This is of course only a kata or a form, so it probably looks rather stiff and rigid. In actual application, of course, this kind of technique would have much more flow to it. This technique is one from the Idori section of the Nikajo set. When the opponent comes to grab your wrists, you perceive this and immediately launch a distracting counterattack. This is not sen no sen, or preemptive initiative, but rather go no sen, or reactive initiative. The opponent is already making his attack and you are too late, so you apply Aiki using this kind of movement. I distract him with a strike across his eyes, and take hold of the back of his hand like this, placing the edge of my hand straight across the back of his so that it forms a right angle. Then I turn his hand over and bring him down to the floor, in such a way that all his weight falls onto the line of his arm. Then, with him immobilized in that position, I deliver a finishing strike. While this is a very simple technique, I think it has a great deal of depth, and so it is one that needs to be practiced carefully and with clear attention to detail. When the opponent comes to strike down from above, as with a sword or other blade, we enter in empty-handed to avoid the attack and take him down. The key here is to time your movement to coincide exactly with the instant he is putting his foot down, and sweep his foot at that moment. Then with my right hand I use my knuckle to strike the inside of his knee. At this point, I use my knuckle to strike this as I sweep. I put these two motions together. Then I turn his leg over immediately so that he can't kick. Then I put a final strike to his groin. unbalance him with a very large movement and throw with a small movement. You've already taken his balance here, and using a large movement like this to throw will let him regain that balance and possibly counterattack. So you must unbalance him with large movement and throw with a small one. One point all of these techniques have in common is to continue the unbalancing motion throughout, and this is very important. If you don't, you leave openings for him to attack you. Continue unbalancing from here, and then, keeping him in that state, throw. I'll show this also from the perspective of Ippondori. You can see here how I keep unbalancing him all the way down. Another important point, in addition to keeping the unbalancing effect happening, is that the effect of your technique must also continue all the way through. In this case, I'm applying pressure against the outside of his wrist and also locking his elbow joint. I keep unbalancing him and keeping the pressure on this joint so that the effect is continuous. Even as I withdraw, I still have pressure on the outside of his wrist. So to reiterate, a proper technique continues to unbalance the opponent all the way through and also continues to affect and manipulate him from start to finish so that no openings are ever left. For rear techniques, I have to develop so-called eyes in the back of my head, using all five senses to perceive my opponent's aggressive intention the instant it occurs, and intuit what he is doing behind me. Then I lift up my elbows to break his hold, and in that way float him upward and forward. From there I use my other hand to trap his hand against my chest, and keeping it pinned there, I take him down into a joint lock. I finish with a kick to his side. With my left hand, I pin his hand to my chest, raising my elbow, then turn my arm and shoulder over to bring him down, taking him into a wrist lock, which I apply by cutting with my little fingers and pressing with my thumbs. As suggested by the name Daito Ryu Aikijujutsu, Daito Ryu is a jujutsu or grappling style that involves the use of Aiki, and for that reason I would like to take a look at the meaning of this Aiki. One definition of Aiki is how one disrupts the opponent's balance. Exploring how to break the opponent's balance is, I think, the first aspect of Aiki that we study. There are various attacks against which to practice Aiki, but let's start with a single-handed grab to the wrist. He grabs me here. And at that instant, just as his hand is about to close on my wrist, at that point it's important to have already unbalanced him. The moment he touches me, just as he gets to me, I break his balance. In this case, the opponent leans over, putting himself slightly off balance, and you take advantage of that momentary state by moving your hands like this. If you extend your hand, he can grab it from a stable position, so keep your hand down here, in this position. Then use the momentary opening to unseat his balance. At this point, then you can go into any technique you want. This kind of entering is also Aiki. And so is this. Right as he grips, I turn my hand, turning my thumb and little finger so that my fingers point toward his eyes. This allows me to apply Aiki effectively. Turning the thumb and little finger. Without turning the thumb and little finger, his arm will simply bend. So I use the turning of my hand to make his arm straighten. You can do the same when he grabs both wrists. Turn the thumb and little finger on both hands to unbalance him, then throw.
女子護身応用。合気武道の法形の中には秘伝目録、そして今ご覧いただいておりますような合気の術というのが申しまして、先ほどから申しております合気というその合気投げがこの技法の中に秘められているわけでございます。本来大東流の大は大中小の大にして全てを包含する絶対の大でございます。また大は始めともより、また小さな始まりより絶対大に至る大きさを表すものでございます。二人と大東流合気武道には秘伝目録IkkajoからGokajo118本裏表、合気の術裏表、秘伝奥義、秘奥義、ご神用の手84本、解釈送伝、回伝のこと88本と各種の技がございます。 その中から、ご神応用の手を用いまして今演舞させていただいております。現在大統領の中では武田時宗先生より免許皆伝をいただいたただ一人の人物で、現在演舞されております近藤宗家大は宗家時宗先生より免許皆伝をいただいておりますただ一人の人物でございます。大統領の技の中にはこのように両方の手を分けて相手を制している。で絶えず多人数の敵に対して備えるという動作が含まれております。4人取り。
それから人としてつながったのでございます。相手の腕を体に投げる。
Sokaku Takeda issued a teacher's certification called Kyoju Dairi to quite a few of his various students. For that reason, today there are so many different individuals and groups claiming to teach Daito Ryu that it's difficult for people to distinguish between them or know who is teaching what. Probably that was one reason Tokimune Sensei chose to award Kyoju Dairi certification to only 2 people, myself and a Mr. Shinpachi Suzuki. Mr. Suzuki passed away at an early age, which means that I am now the only one of Tokimune Sensei's pupils to hold this certification.
大統領時宗先生の門下で教授代理をいただいたのは私一人になってしまったわけですね。そういうふうなことがございまして。
I think because Tokimune Sensei was concerned about the leadership of Daito Ryu in the future, he actually didn't want to give out too many Kyoju Dairi licenses. He knew if he did, it would lead to chaos and confusion within the Daito Ryu tradition. Now, because Daito Ryu has come down through the ages as a family tradition within the Takeda family, the most ideal course of succession would have been for a member of that family to inherit and continue the tradition. That being the case, among the responsibilities I took on when I received Soke Dairi certification from Tokimune Sensei was the task of putting Daito Ryu back into the Takeda family by way of one of his grandsons. This would involve me teaching everything I had learned about Daito Ryu to that grandson, and I was ready to do that, to act as a kind of bridge to transfer Daito Ryu from one generation to the next. Unfortunately, I've been unable to fulfill this role with either of Tokimune's grandsons. I did try to bring them in by inviting them to the dojo, trying to urge them to come train, and even having dinner with them and so on, to try to set up that relationship. I talked with them at length on various occasions, but it didn't come to anything. They even said things to me like, "I've already read my grandfather's Menkyo Kaiden scrolls, so that's enough," and things like that. I was fairly shocked by that attitude. What it means is that the transmission of Daito Ryu within the bloodline of the Takeda family has come to an end, at least as far as its technical content is concerned, because that technical content has not been inherited by any member of the Takeda family. I sometimes wonder if my own efforts in this matter were insufficient, if I should have tried to do more to convince the parties involved. I don't really know, but in any case, the situation has ended up as I've just described.
最初海外というご縁はですね。
The first activity of Daito Ryu Abroad for me came with a request from the Japan Classical Budo Association, which was sponsoring demonstrations in various countries abroad by groups involved in traditional Japanese Budo. As for qualified teachers abroad, a student of mine named Mark Sumi, who trained with me as an uchideshi for about 9 years, has relocated to Los Angeles. Also in the United States, there is a group near Baltimore, Maryland, that has put together something that we're calling a Daito Ryu study group under my guidance. This group isn't a branch dojo per se, but they are practicing and studying Daito Ryu under my backing and support.
皆さんで稽古しております。そういうふうなことがございますね。それからまた門下生の中にはですね、変わったところではある国の
Among the more unusual of my students, I've been teaching Daito Ryu to the members of the royal family of a certain country for about 6 years now.
交流が始まってですね、その国の国王の前で2回ほど
I've even been asked to give demonstrations before the Sultan there on 2 occasions, and this year the Sultan himself has also expressed interest in taking up practice.
それから国王と両方にですね、指導をしておるということでございます。武道というのはですね、
In my view, Budo is part of what we call culture. Now, Japan has changed a great deal in our modern times, but I think that Budo is one of the few areas in which we can still find the traditional spirit of Japanese culture.
なんつうんですかね、日本の精神といいますかね、そういうものが残っているというのはやっぱり武道であり、宗教であると思うんですね。
In the art of tea, they use the preparation of tea as a tool for personal and spiritual growth. In traditional flower arrangement, they use flowers. And likewise, in Budo, we can say that we borrow martial arts techniques for the same purpose, for self-cultivation. In other words, I don't think Budo is really about winning over other people. Rather, it's about winning over yourself, rising above yourself and your current limitations so that you can grow mentally and spiritually. The Japanese characters used to write the word for human being suggest that as people, we are somewhere between being animals and being human, that by a gradual process of enlightening ourselves, little by little, we can strive toward achieving true humanity, or perhaps even beyond to sainthood. And through that, we may even eventually be able to approach what is sometimes referred to as a state of great enlightenment. The issue then becomes how we use